Mopsa the Fairy by Jean Ingelow. Chapter 1. Above the Clouds. And can this be my own world? 'Tis all gold and snow, save where scarlet waves are hurled down yon gulf below. 'Tis thy world, 'tis my world, city, mead, and shore, for he that hath his own world hath many worlds more. A boy whom I knew very well was once going through a meadow which was full of buttercups. The nurse and his baby sister were with him, and when they got to an old hawthorn which grew in the hedge and was covered with blossom, they all sat down in its shade, and the nurse took out 3 slices of plum cake, gave 1 to each of the children, and kept 1 for herself. While the boy was eating, he observed that this hedge was very high and thick, and that there was a great hollow in the trunk of the old thorn tree, and he heard a twittering as if there was a nest somewhere inside. So he thrust his head in, twisted himself round, and looked up. It was a very great thorn tree, and the hollow was so large that 2 or 3 boys could have stood upright in it. And when he got used to the dim light in that brown still place, he saw that a good way above his head there was a nest. Rather a curious one, too, for it was as large as a pair of blackbirds would have built, and yet it was made of fine white wool and delicate bits of moss. In short, it was like a goldfinch's nest magnified 3 times. Just then he thought he heard some little voices cry, "Jack! Jack!" His baby sister was asleep, and the nurse was reading a storybook, so it could not have been either of them who called. "I must go in here," said the boy. "I wish this hole was larger." So he began to wriggle and twist himself through, and just as he pulled in his last foot, he looked up, and 3 heads, which had been peeping over the edge of the nest, suddenly popped down again. "Those heads had no beaks, I'm sure," said Jack, and he stood on tiptoe and poked in one of his fingers. "And the things have no feathers," he continued. So the hollow being rather rugged, he managed to climb up and look in. His eyes were not used yet to the dim light, but he was sure those things were not birds, no. He poked them, and they took no notice. But when he snatched one of them out of the nest, it gave a loud squeak and said, "Oh, don't, Jack!" as plainly as possible, upon which he was so frightened that he lost his footing, dropped the thing, and slipped down himself. Luckily he was not hurt, nor the thing either. He could see it quite plainly now. It was creeping about like rather an old baby, and had on a little frock and pinafore. "It's a fairy!" exclaimed Jack to himself. "How curious! And this must be a fairy's nest. Oh, how angry the old mother will be if this little thing creeps away and gets out of the hole." So he looked down. "Oh, the hole is on the other side," he said, and he turned round, but the hole was not on the other side. It was not on any side. It must have closed up all on a sudden while he was looking into the nest, for, look whichever way he would, there was no hole at all, except a very little one high up over the nest, which let in a very small sunbeam. Jack was very much astonished, but he went on eating his cake, and was so delighted to see the young fairy climb up the side of the hollow and scramble again into her nest that he laughed heartily, upon which all the nestlings popped up their heads and, showing their pretty white teeth, pointed at the slice of cake. "Well," said Jack, "I may have to stay inside here for a long time, and I have nothing to eat but this cake. However, your mouths are very small, so you shall have a piece." And he broke off a small piece and put it into the nest, climbing up to see them eat it. The young fairies were a long time dividing and munching the cake, and before they had finished it began to be rather dark, for a black cloud came over and covered the little sunbeam. At the same time the wind rose and rocked the boughs and made the old tree creak and tremble. Then there was a thunder and rain, and the little fairies were so frightened that they got out of the nest and crept into Jack's pockets. One got into each waistcoat pocket, and the other two were very comfortable, for he took out his handkerchief and made room for them in the pocket of his jacket. It got darker and darker, till at last Jack could only see the hole, and it seemed to be a very long way off. Every time he looked at it, it was farther off, and at last he saw a thin crescent moon shining through it. "I am sure it cannot be night yet," he said, and he took out one of the fattest of the young fairies and held it up towards the hole. "Look at that," said he. "What is to be done now? The hole is so far off that it's night up there, and down here I haven't done eating my lunch." "Well," answered the young fairy, "then why don't you whistle?" Jack was surprised to hear her speak in this sensible manner, and in the light of the moon he looked at her very attentively. "When first I saw you in the nest," said he, "you had a pinafore on, and now you have a smart little apron with lace round it." "That is because I am much older now," said the fairy. "We never take such a long time to grow up as you do." "But your pinafore," said Jack. "Turned into an apron, of course," replied the fairy, "just as your velvet jacket will turn into tailcoat when you are old enough." "It won't," said Jack. "Yes, it will," answered the fairy, with an air of superior wisdom. "Don't argue with me. I am older now than you are, nearly grown up, in fact. Put me into your pocket again and whistle as loudly as you can." Jack laughed, put her in, and pulled out another. "Worse and worse," he said. "Why, this was a boy fairy, and now he has a mustache and a sword, and looks as fierce as possible." "I think I heard my sister tell you to whistle," said the fairy very sternly. "Yes, she did," said Jack. "Well, I suppose I had better do it." So he whistled very loudly indeed. "Why did you leave off so soon?" said another of them, peeping out. "Why, if you wish to know," answered Jack, "it was because I thought something took hold of my legs." "Ridiculous, child!" cried the last of the four. "How do you think you are ever to get out, if she doesn't take hold of your legs?" Jack thought he would rather have done a long division sum than have been obliged to whistle, but he could not help doing it when they told him, and he felt something take hold of his legs again, and then give him a jerk which hoisted him onto its back, where he sat astride, and wondered whether the thing was a pony. But it was not, for he presently observed that it had a very slender neck, and then that it was covered with feathers. It was a large bird, and he presently found that they were rising towards the hole, which had become so very far off, and in a few minutes she dashed through the hole, with Jack on her back and all the fairies in his pockets. It was so dark that he could see nothing, and he twined his arms round the bird's neck to hold on, upon which this agreeable fowl told him not to be afraid, and said she hoped he was comfortable. "I should be more comfortable," replied Jack, "if I knew how I could get home again. I don't wish to go home just yet, for I want to see where we are flying to, but Papa and Mamma will be frightened if I never do." "Oh, no," replied the albatross, for she was an albatross. "You need not be at all afraid about that. When boys go to fairyland, their parents never are uneasy about them." "Really?" exclaimed Jack. "Quite true," replied the albatross. "So are we going to fairyland?" exclaimed Jack. "How delightful!" "Yes," said the albatross. "The back way, mind. We are only going the back way. You could go in 2 minutes by the usual route, but these fairies want to go before they are summoned, and therefore you and I are taking them." And she continued to fly on in the dark sky for a very long time. "They seem to be fast asleep," said Jack. "Perhaps they will sleep till we come to the wonderful river," replied the albatross, and just then she flew with a great bump against something that met her in the air. "What craft is this that hangs out no light?" said a gruff voice. "I might ask the same question of you," answered the albatross sullenly. "I am only a poor will-o'-the-wisp," replied the voice, "and you know very well that I have but a lantern to show." Thereupon a lantern became visible, and Jack saw by the light of it a man who looked old and tired, and he was so transparent that you could see through him, lantern and all. I hope I have not hurt you, William, said the albatross. I will light up immediately. Good night. Good night, answered the will-o'-the-wisp. I am going down as fast as I can. The storm blew me up, and I am never easy excepting in my native swamps. Jack might have taken more notice of Will if the albatross had not begun to light up. She did it in this way. First, one of her eyes began to gleam with a beautiful green light, which cast its rays far and near. And then, when it was as bright as a lamp, the other eye began to shine, and the light of that eye was red. In short, she was lighted up just like a vessel at sea. Jack was so happy that he hardly knew which to look at first. There really were so many remarkable things. They snore, said the albatross. They are very fast asleep, and before they wake, I should like to talk to you a little. She meant that the fairies snored, and so they did, in Jack's pockets. My name, continued the albatross, is Jenny. Do you think you shall remember that? Because when you're in fairyland and want someone to take you home again and call, Jenny, I shall be able to come to you, and I shall come with pleasure, for I like boys better than fairies. Thank you, said Jack. Oh, yes, I shall remember your name. It is such a very easy one. If it is in the night that you want me, just look up, continued the albatross, and you will see a green and red spark moving in the air. You will then call, Jenny, and I will come. But remember that I cannot come unless you do call me. Very well, said Jack, but he was not attending, because there was so much to be seen. In the first place, all the stars excepting a few large ones were gone, and they looked frightened. And as it got lighter, one after the other seemed to give a little start in the blue sky and go out. And then Jack looked down and saw, as he thought, a great country, covered with very jagged snow mountains, with astonishingly sharp peaks. Here and there he saw a very deep lake. At least he thought it was a lake. But while he was admiring the mountains, there came an enormous crack between two of the largest, and he saw the sun come rolling up among them, and it seemed to be almost smothered. Why, those are clouds, exclaimed Jack, and oh, how rosy they have all turned. I thought they were mountains. Yes, they are clouds, said the albatross. And then they turned gold color, and next they began to plunge and tumble, and every one of the peaks put on a glittering crown, and next they broke themselves to pieces and began to drift away. In fact, Jack had been out all night, and now it was morning.